In this session, we will learn about Incoterms 2020. Incoterms are trade terms coined by International Chamber of Commerce to define responsibility of buyer and seller for delivering the goods from one place to another. Incoterms are revised on regular basis and currently Incoterms 2020 are used. Imagine seller's factory is in Delhi and the buyer is located in Sydney. Now to deliver goods to buyer, additional cost like inland transportation cost in the country of origin and destination, port handling charges in the seller's and buyer's country, transportation cost for shipment by sea, air, rail, road, insurance of goods, import duties, etc. have to be paid. Incoterms define the responsibility of both the parties regarding bearing the additional cost and associated risk. There are 11 Incoterms which can be classified into four categories: E, F, C, and D. Out of these 11 Incoterms, 4 terms are used for shipment by sea and another 7 can be used with any mode of transportation. First of all, we'll try and see the Incoterms for shipment of goods by sea. FAS, or free alongside ship. When this Incoterm is used, seller is responsible for placing the goods alongside the ship nominated by the buyer. All other cost and risk are to be borne by the buyer. All the export formalities must be completed by the seller, whereas import formalities are responsibility of the buyer. FOB, or free on board. In case of FOB, seller must ensure that the goods are loaded on the ship nominated by the buyer. Beyond that, all the cost and risk have to be borne by the buyer. Export and import formalities are to be completed by the seller and buyer respectively. CFR, or cost and freight. Under CFR, seller is liable to contract for and pay necessary ocean freight up to the port of discharge. The risk of carrying the goods will pass from the seller to the buyer after the goods are loaded on the ship. Export and import formalities are to be completed by the seller and buyer respectively. CIF, or cost, insurance, and freight. In this case, seller is responsible to contract for and pay necessary ocean freight and also obtain insurance for the goods. The risk will, however, pass from the seller to the buyer after the goods are loaded on the ship. Seller and buyer will be responsible for export and import formalities in their respective countries. Now we will be discussing Incoterms for shipment of goods by any mode of transport. EXW or EXWorks. Seller bears minimum cost and risk in case of EXWorks. Seller is responsible for keeping the goods ready for shipment at his premises or at named place. All the responsibilities like to arrange the carrier, transportation, and insurance are to be arranged by the buyer. Export and import formalities are the responsibilities of buyer in this case. FCA, or free carrier. Seller is responsible for loading the goods on the carrier nominated by the buyer at his premises or at named place. Thereafter, the cost and risk passes on to the buyer. Seller is required to complete export formalities in this case. CPT, or carriage paid to. Seller is liable to arrange the carrier and bear the cost of carriage of goods to the named destination. Risk will pass from seller to the buyer after the goods are loaded on the carrier. Seller and buyer are liable to ensure that all formalities related to export and import are completed by them in their respective countries. CIP, or carriage and insurance paid to. In carriage and insurance paid to, seller is responsible for arranging for carriage and obtain insurance of the goods up to named destination. The risk will pass from seller to the buyer after the goods are loaded on the carrier. Formalities related to export and import are responsibility of the seller and buyer respectively. DAP or delivered at place. Seller is responsible for delivering the goods to a named destination. All the cost and risk has to be borne by the seller till the goods reach the destination. Buyer is responsible for unloading of goods and other associated cost and risk. Seller and buyer are liable to ensure that all formalities related to export and import are completed by them in their respective countries. Delivered at place unloaded. Seller is responsible for delivering the goods to named destination after completing all custom formalities. Buyer is responsible for unloading of goods from the carrier. Export and import formalities must be completed by seller and buyer respectively. DDP or delivered duty paid. Seller has maximum responsibility in this case as he has to bear all the cost and risk till the time goods reached named destination, unloaded from the carrier. Seller is responsible to complete export and import formalities. So this is it about the 11 Incoterms. Thank you